G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're bringing you more guests from our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. There can be no trust in government without accountability. Yet it's been more than 2 years since the coalition government promised it would implement a Commonwealth Integrity Commission, but still, there is not even any draft legislation in sight. And at the beginning of this pandemic, the government was spending taxpayers' money at a rate of about $20 billion a day. And before this recession ends, tens of billions of dollars more of taxpayers' money will have to be spent. But that initial spending all happened while Parliament was adjourned, and it was the Australia Institute that led the charge for a special COVID committee set up within Parliament to scrutinise government decisions during this time. Yet, even after the establishment of that committee, the Prime Minister's handpicked National COVID-19 Coordination Commission operates with a lot of secrecy and virtually without any oversight or accountability. And just this week, it was revealed that only one of the 6 commissioners on that commission has volunteered to release publicly their conflicts of interest. So the issue of accountability and transparency has never been more pertinent or more important.
Hands up if you think there's no corruption in federal politics.
If you're working the mining sector, you need to know how to solve problems, and big ones. When I rang him the other day, I simply said, Nev, I need you to serve your country.
So can you give me a guarantee that absolutely nobody, no people on the commission, will stand to personally gain from that? Can you give me a guarantee on that?
I can't do that, Senator.
Why not?
Well, I don't know what their individual circumstances are, and it depends on what happens.
The CEO in front of the Senate inquiry wasn't even sure. He admitted the task and duties were opaque. He was unclear about certain actions. He couldn't confirm exactly how many special advisors there were. He indicated there had been lobbying for projects but wasn't specific. There is absolutely no information.
One of the key issues here has been lack of transparency and a lack of trust.
Government has been reluctant to release this modelling.
This is largely uncharted territory that we're in here, and that's why scrutiny would benefit the government.
I think it's been poorly set up, and I think over time it will unravel.
So to discuss safeguarding our democracy, this week our guests were the independent member for Indi, Helen Haines, who has been a vocal supporter of the need for a federal anti-corruption commission, as well as former Court of Appeals Justice at the Supreme Court of Victoria, David Harper, and former Justice of the Supreme Court of Queensland, Margaret White, both of whom are members of the Australia Institute's National Integrity Committee, which has designed the principles for establishing a federal anti-corruption commission with teeth. They were joined by our Chief Economist, Richard Dennis, and this was recorded live on Friday the 12th of June 2020, and things may have changed since recording. And just an apology, Helen Haines was joining the webinar from Parliament House, where apparently the internet connection isn't so great, and so the sound is a little laggy to begin with, and we apologise for that, but if you stick with it, it does improve.
Oh, thank you, Ebony, and hello to all the listeners out there, and I'm seeing there's around 811 now. I first just want to thank the Australia Institute for organising this important event, to Justice White and Justice Harper and the National Integrity Committee more broadly for their work in this space, and to everyone who's made an effort to attend. And yes, yesterday, the crossbench, led yesterday by Adam Bant, moving a motion in the House to bring on the Federal Senate last September, actually, to bring it on to the House for debate and a vote. But indeed, we were not successful in that bid. We were shut down by the government, and I was the seconder to that motion and was indeed gagged in my attempt to call for debate on the Federal Integrity Commission bill.
The member for Indi.
I second this motion. Mr Speaker, the government has missed its own deadlines on introducing a Federal Integrity Commission bill. The member for Indi will resume her seat. The Minister.
I move that the member be no longer heard.
Minister has moved that the member for Indi be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no.
think the ayes have it. Division required.
So maybe I will just speak more broadly, Ebony, and I guess introduce what we're talking about today. And I suppose really the phrase safeguarding our democracy is not exactly a knee-jerk reaction when one thinks about the economics of a pandemic. But from my experience as an independent in this parliament, ensuring integrity in federal public administration and protecting the right of parliament to scrutinise all public officials, from senior public servants to parliamentarians and their staff, is absolutely crucial in a crisis. And there are many examples, and you just touched on one then, where this government has let slip on its duty in this crisis. And I think the NCCC is indeed one of those places. And of course, we know that there's an unwillingness from the government to allow the Treasurer and other ministers to front from the House to front the Senate COVID inquiry, which is in fact the only parliamentary oversight mechanism this country has had for many months while the Parliament has not been sitting. I also want to say is that we save democracy even when we are not in a time of crisis. A way of bringing things that are important for, but there are issues like sports fraud, things like the sister and the Mayor of Sydney. But I guess what I want to say really is rather, a fascinating thing at this point in history. We've seen a falling trust in government and a disillusionment with politics for democracy for a long time now. And in fact, we've caused... Okay.
We can hear you okay, Helen. It's just the video's lagging a bit in places.
All right. So you can hear me. I'm going to continue. I'm getting a few messages. It's not going so well. Okay. So I was just talking about a lack of trust all over the world. But what we've got right now in Australia, I think, which is fascinating in a time of crisis, is that the government asked all of us, all of you listening right now, to trust them in ways that we could never have imagined before. And it's asked Australians to download the COVID Safe app, to accept indefinite suspension of Parliament, to be responsible for social distancing, knowing the impact that has on our social liberties, so that we could flatten the curve. And this was a huge extension of trust from the Australian public to the government. And I think, and I reckon you would agree with me, that the Australian public should expect some reciprocity here, and that level of trust and transparency that we gave so willingly is a two-way street. And this time that we should be calling for a Federal Integrity Commission by way of repaying that trust, if not for all the other valid reasons. I think that we would also say, really, and I think it is extraordinary because, I'm a former public health researcher and a midwife. I'm not a legal practitioner, but I know that it was an extraordinary effort from the public to flatten the curve, and we did that. We did that because the government on that occasion decided to listen to experts. It took the politics out of policy. It listened to experts, and I'm saying really that it's time to listen to the experts yet again on the Federal Integrity Commission, and we have experts with us today with Justice White and Justice Harper. And if we listen to experts, we do get good public policy. We've seen that in the pandemic. But as you said at the introduction, it's nearly 2 years since the government promised us its bill. And I am not here really to politicise this. I'm really here to get the job done. And I came to independent politics really not for the mudslinging. I came here to see and do what the people in my electorate called me to do. And one of those key things was to fight for a robust Federal Integrity Commission. And one way of doing that, really, and to steer clear of pointless politicisation, was to find a touchstone for everyday Australians to buy into what this is all about. And so in February this year, joined by Justice Harper, actually, I introduced the Beechworth Principles. And I chose that, the Beechworth Principles, because of a story, an incredibly symbolic story that occurred in 1853 in Beechworth, beautiful gold mining town in my electorate, whereby an innocent young gold digger named William Guest was shot and killed by police in a flagrant misuse of power. And his murder was then subject to a closed hearing with key evidence suppressed. And that absolutely was an appalling situation which the gold diggers refused to accept, and they did something about it. And I think it's a great unifying story, and I love it for what it symbolises. And that is that there is a tradition in this country that's bigger than all of us, that comes before all of us. And it says that we know when things don't feel right, and we believe in the power of community. We believe in the power of community to set up systems that will make them right in the public interest. So for me, that Beechworth story then precipitated me coming up with 5 key principles. First one is broad jurisdiction, to investigate the people it needs to in a Federal Integrity Commission. Common rules so that everybody is held to the same standard of behaviour. Appropriate powers so that a Federal Integrity Commission can actually do its job. Fair hearings so that investigations are done openly when in the public interest, and accountability to the people, not to political interests. And I think that, one of the purposes of these principles is to give me and engage members of the general public like you listening, some clear and traditional principles, not politicised ones, that can help us unpack whatever bill comes before us and see if it actually does pass that test. I think they can take the sting out of the debate, and I think that they're a unifying way for me to come to the table with other MPs to talk about a Federal Integrity Commission in a safe intellectual meeting place, and really talk about what a commission should look like, and again, get away from the politics. So at the end of the day, I'm a community independent. I'm here pushing this because integrity is something that communities right across Indi tell me is really important. And I know that to get this over the line is going to take a considerable amount of bravery, and I'm going to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations, and there'll be a lot of uncomfortable movements like yesterday. First time in the House I was ever gagged, didn't like it much. But, I'm a rural midwife by background, and I know that bravery is something that we need to have, and I also know that it takes vision and collegiality, and I think the Beechworth principles give us that. And I also know that it, just like those gold miners, it takes an inspired and driven public to call out, and I invite you all to write to your Member of Parliament right around the country and push them to have a look at the Beechworth principles, to come and have a talk to me, to step away from politics and do what this Federal Integrity Commission is really aiming to do, and that's set a culture of integrity across the Parliament. And I think together we could do something genuinely landmark in this Parliament.
Thank you so much, Helen. And I will say Helen is joining us from Parliament House, and there is a risk that the bells could ring and Helen has to leave us for a vote. So we thank you so much for your time today, and apologies if you're having any issues with Helen's audio there. The Parliament House network is not really that great, ironically, but we really appreciate that, Helen. And like you said, those Beechworth principles, it is so important to have that kind of, that setting to base everything off. But Margaret, I wondered if I might come to you next. You've made some comments in the past, more recently, about some specific concerns around the National COVID-19 Coordination Commission. I wondered if you might just talk to us a little bit about your concerns there.
Thanks, Ebony, and could I say thank you very much, Helen, for those really quite inspirational, apolitical words, if I can say, which really enables people from all spectrums of political interest to feel, I think, drawn together and very comfortable with this terrific endeavour. And the people of your electorate must be very proud of how hard you work for this very, very important interest. The NCCC committee, when it was established, did seem a kind of rather odd body, I must say, because it was charged, as we understood, and now know from reading the terms of reference, with advising the government on everything except health, and it was to coordinate with the major health committee. And yet, when one looked at the composition of the very outstanding people who are members of that committee, and I wouldn't wish to suggest that they're anything other than that, its focus from the personnel, notwithstanding some of their interest in philanthropy and so on, but their focus did look extremely narrow. And I have taken the opportunities, I'm sure lots of listeners have done, to look at the transcript of the appearance before the oversight committee, which has been established to look into the government's response to COVID-19. And I'm not really reassured very much by reading that transcript. The first appearance of the CEO was, in a sense, deeply disappointing because it didn't really seem to know very much about what it was doing at all. Mr. Parr appeared on the 4th of June and he certainly answered a number of the questions that were raised that people were concerned, I think, about. But the conflict of interests are very stark, and I really don't feel comforted by statements that they're all company directors, they understand about conflicts of interest, they're used to registering them and things of that kind. They're not publicly available, and it is essentially a public committee. And I think that one would really wish to see those conflicts much more robustly addressed so that we could have assurance. As far as I can tell, there's no real underpinning for the commission, and whether it's to be grounded in some kind of legislation if it's to go forward. They say it'll last for 6 months, but it could last for longer. But the way it's funded is definitely opaque, and the accountability seems to be minimal. They say they're getting a lot of submissions from people for projects to be recommended, but again, that process seems to be, again, rather obscure and not really quite what we're used to, I think. This kind of work used to be developed in government departments, getting advice, and you could get outside advice. This seems to be an extraordinary amount of power to give to such a body, which was very much a pick of the Prime Minister. So there's some of the concerns that I would have, Ebony, about that particular body.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. David, I'll come to you next. I was going to ask you just to go back, I guess, to the bigger picture. So Helen's talked about some of the the more recent concerns, and Margaret there talking about the NCCC during this pandemic period. But the push for an anti-corruption commission, goes back a few years now, and I guess it's always been a concern that there were gaps in our federal integrity system operating nationally. So how important is it to have a strong, independent anti-corruption commission operating at the national level?
I think it's absolutely vital. The democratic system requires there to be accountability, and without a National Integrity Commission, that accountability will be sadly deficient. The confluence of money and power is a recipe for those who are unscrupulous to seek to exercise their influence in corrupt ways to gain personal or corporate benefit from government. And Canberra is necessarily the place where money and power come together most clearly in Australia, and most definitely. The consequence is that corruption, because we are who we are, we're human beings, will result. Temptation comes with money and with power, and without a National Integrity Commission, the temptations will occur, and they will be followed by corrupt actions, and there'll be no consequences. the difficulty which we face as members of the public in assuring ourselves that those we elect and those who we pay give appropriate value for money is that the mechanisms for accountability are far less than they should be. And at the apex of the problem is the lack of a National Integrity Commission. I think it is absolutely vital for the preservation of democracy that a commission with appropriate powers be created as soon as it possibly can be. And it's a very great disappointment that it has taken politicians from all sides until now to even start to grapple with the problem. And it's taken the government more than 2 years to get a bill together that is anything like sufficient to enable the creation of the kind of commission which we desperately need.
Thanks, David. Richard, I'll come to you quickly. The Australian Institute has obviously been involved for quite some time now in the push for an anti-corruption commission, but are there any economic implications for a lack of integrity, a lack of trust in government?
Absolutely. I mean, let's assume that everyone involved in the government is of the utmost integrity as individuals, and let's assume that all the business people who've been brought in to give advice are of the utmost integrity in the giving of advice to government. The fact that the individuals involved might genuinely believe they have enormous integrity and might objectively have enormous integrity doesn't mean the process has integrity. Putting people in a privileged advisory position where people bring their perspective, the things they're familiar with, the things they're confident about, just simply putting people in that privileged advisory committee privileges a particular mindset, a particular worldview, and a particular industry. So even if, and I don't actually believe brown paper bags are changing hands here, even if all of the people involved believe they're behaving with the utmost integrity, just as justice needs to be not just done, but seen to be done, well, integrity and public policy making and prioritisation of something as urgent as our response to this crisis needs to be seen to be done. And the lack of reflection from the people involved in this, such that they think, oh, but everyone on here is a company director, so what could possibly be wrong? It's the most alarming possibility is they actually believe that is true and believe that saying that should be the end of it. So let's assume that most people in Australia aren't corrupt, that most people in Australia do act with integrity. What it means is that in Australia today, millions of businesses are potentially missing out on stimulus opportunities, on employment opportunities, on income for them and their families, because some people in Australia have privileged access to a government decision making, and for reasons that the government hasn't described, it thinks rather than rely on public servants with deep expertise who are covered by the Public Service Act, despite the fact that we spend tens of billions of dollars on that bureaucracy, in a time of crisis we want to go out to a small hand-picked group of people. So I agree with everything we've heard today about the importance of cracking down on corruption in its traditional form. But again, I think justice needs to be seen to be done, and refusing to have transparency for things like the COVID response committee and refusing to create something like a corruption watchdog, an integrity committee, that should alarm all of the people and all of the businesses in Australia that know they're not doing anything wrong.
Thanks, Richard. Helen, I might come back to you again. And going back to this idea of the importance of an integrity commission nationally, because, obviously not all corrupt behaviour is necessarily illegal. And sometimes, you can even have corporations or individuals behaving corruptly, within a government process without the knowledge of public servants who are involved in that. And we've certainly seen some incidents of that come out through the New South Wales ICAC, for example. But is your sense that, there's obviously no urgency from the government, but clearly the crossbench has the sense of how important integrity is for the trust of the public in the operations of government and ultimately trust in our democracy. But is your sense that the government, understands the problem? Is that reflected in how they've talked about its Commonwealth Integrity Commission so far?
Look, Ebony, one would assume that when the government went to the last election promising a Federal Integrity Commission, that they did indeed believe that there was a need for one, and that they had an intention to establish one. And of course, they sent out a draft bill for submissions, and 75 submissions were received. Which had many ideas for improvements on the bill, but that's where it's stalled. So the fact that it has stalled now for this long, it does raise the question in the mind of the crossbench that perhaps the government really is commission at all. Now, they will tell you something else, and I'm in good faith. I would like to believe them. So hence my call to bring it on, bring that bill on for debate. And if not that bill, then indeed we have a rather good bill from the Senate that was based on the bill that my predecessor, Cathy McGowan, took to the Parliament, and let's debate it. So I think, again, this is about trust. The public, and I can see on the comments flying through now that the public jumped to the conclusion that if the government doesn't want to bring on the Federal Integrity Commission bill, then they must have something to hide. So again, I would say to the government, get rid of that sense of a lack of trust in the public right now and bring it on. Just dismiss that claim that you've got something to hide by bringing on the bill. Let's debate it. This is a parliament. This is the place where we can look at legislation and, in good faith, improve it and find something that we can agree on. And some might say that's a very naive view of parliament, but I would argue that is what we are here for. And again, I would say that my rather straightforward 5 principles give a very transparent framework by which to judge how good any bill is.
Thanks, Helen. We might go now to questions from the audience, and we've got about 28 questions here, and I just did want to give a shout out to, I think we've got about 950 people on this webinar with us, so thank you all for joining us for this really important discussion. I'll kick off with a question about from Susan Werris, who asks, please explain how gagging debate on any issue the government doesn't like reflects democratic first principles, and why was it introduced into parliamentary procedures, and how can it be intended to be used in a principled and democratic way, and who can gag debate and who can't? So Helen, I think that one's really probably a question for you.
Yeah, and look, I think it's a great question. And when I came to Parliament, I really had no idea about this whole notion of gagging people. I hadn't been watching Parliament closely for years to see this. And indeed, more experienced parliamentarians tell me that this particular Parliament is using this capacity to gag more than any other Parliament that they have had experience of. Essentially, the Leader of the House can shut down a parliamentarian by saying that the member shall no longer be heard. It usually comes about when a member stands and seeks the call in the House to suspend standing orders, which essentially means to say, look, we've got the agenda for the day, but I'm not that happy with the agenda for the day because I think I've got something really important that I want to bring to the attention of the Parliament, like we might in any meeting actually, and plenty of you listening will have been at many, many public meetings whereby there is a set agenda and someone might ask, can they bring something else to the agenda? So that's essentially what's happening, and the Speaker gives the person, the parliamentarian, the call. They ask for a suspension of standing orders. they then put forward their motion or whatever it is that they're wanting to do. The Leader of the House then is asked is leave granted to do this, and the Leader of the House has the capacity to say yes or no. And in my case yesterday, and in many, many instances since I've been an MP, the Leader of the House says no, leave is not granted. It then goes to several processes whereby the House votes whether, in fact, leave should be granted. And in this case, of course, in this Parliament, the government has the numbers. So government members will vote with their Leader of the House and shut down debate. So I hope that's a plain language explanation.
Thanks, Helen. And yeah, so really a function of how the Parliament works and who's got the numbers in the House there to be able to enforce that. The next question, Margaret, I might come to you on this one. Bradford Sherman asks, can Australia end the practice of hiding behind commercial incompetence or on-water matters and other techniques that avoid scrutiny? And he asks, it's Australian taxes getting spent, so surely taxpayers have a right to know how it's being spent. I wondered if you could respond to that.
I think, like many people, I've often been very cynical about the commercial in confidence cry. You think, really? This is government work. It really isn't very commercial at all in the accepted sense in which it was protecting trade secrets, which was the origin of that expression and of course still applies to that narrow group. And I think when you're talking about on-water things, the question is probably talking about the appeal to national security. And there are many things where that appeal is made to shut down debate when it has not one jot to do with national security. Indeed, if I could digress a little, when the Spycatcher book was written many decades ago now, a High Court judge in England, when asked to suppress the publication of the book, said that the ground that was offered was national security. He said, indeed, it is national security. It shows the government to have been so utterly incompetent that people would be alarmed. Not that there was any actual national security. And I suspect that, not that the government's incompetent, but it's things that government don't want the people to know. And perhaps because they're not very proud of them. I'm not sure how one goes about actually stopping it, but I think it should be challenged at every opportunity because we are a parliamentary democracy. People give authority to the government to act on our behalf through the Parliament, and that's where the debate and the transparency and the accountability really should take place. It follows on from Helen's response about gagging. It's inappropriate on the whole.
Helen?
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah, go, Richard.
Look, the whole idea of commercial incompetence is absurd. It's deployed by people with power whenever they feel like it. There is no process for justifying any such claims. And as Margaret said, this is public money that's being spent. A very simple solution, I think, would be to legislate or to otherwise require that all information about government spending of public money on programs is to be revealed, and any corporation that doesn't want the amount of money it's receiving to be publicly known should simply just not tender for the work. I mean, we can actually let the market sort this out. If the companies that are being paid by the public for a service are embarrassed for people to see how much they're being paid, or think it's that to apply for such money would reveal something that is of such value to their corporation they don't want it to be revealed, they should simply not tender for the work.
Thanks, Richard. Helen, did you want to respond to that as well?
Look, I would just again make a general principled comment that this is public money, and when a person is elected to Parliament and when a government successfully wins an election, transparency is fundamental. It's fundamental to our democracy, and I agree with both Richard. Commercial in confidence is a bit of a smokescreen at times, and I think that it's not acceptable to many members of the public. And
We seem to have lost a bit of Helen's audio there. Andrea Wilson, if you're on the line, I'm going to come to you in just a second to ask your question of the panel. But before we move on from that, David, did you want to comment on that concept of commercial in confidence or on water matters and techniques to avoid scrutiny?
Well, those are a number of the techniques that the government uses to avoid scrutiny. Perhaps the most glaring example has arisen from the bugging by the Australian government of the cabinet rooms in East Timor. The Australian government provided the money and the workers to build the government rooms in Dili, in East Timor, and in the process it bugged those rooms. A disgraceful act by the Australian government, and now it is desperately trying to ensure that no real evidence of what happened, how it happened, and why it happened is made available to the Australian public. Those who blew the whistle, or the person who blew the whistle, is now being the subject of criminal proceedings in Canberra, together with his lawyer, who was the former Attorney General of the ACT. And those proceedings are in camera. We don't know what evidence is being called. We don't know what the charges are, except that they have something to do with revealing the secrets of what is said to be national security, but in fact seem to be secrets of bad conduct, illegal conduct by the Australian government. And that is a terrible disgrace to the way our democracy is currently being operated.
Thanks, David. Andrea Wilson, can you hear me there?
Yes, I can.
What's your question for the panel?
It's basically, it's common sense that independents are more likely to represent their constituents while party politicians represent their parties and their donors. Do you think that party politics actually prevents good policy? And what do you think the potential is if there were more independents to break that deadlock? And if so, what advice have you got for grassroots groups looking for candidates like yourself to represent them in their electorates?
Thanks, Andrea. I'll go to you first, Helen.
Thanks, Andrea. Can you hear me all right now, Ebony?
Yes.
Great. Andrea, really, of course, a terrific question from my perspective. Look, firstly, I would say that there are many problems with party politics and many problems with political donations. Firstly, political donations. I think we need much greater transparency in political donations. I supported Rebecca Sharkey's bill in the House earlier this year, which subsequently went to a Senate inquiry and was thrown out as a bad idea, to lower the threshold for political donation disclosure to $1,000. The political parties, the Labor Party have in fact supported that idea, and we gave a dissenting report to that Senate inquiry. But the coalition members of that parliamentary Senate inquiry thought that there was too much burden associated with having better transparency of political donations is a summary, essentially. So I think political donations are very problematic. Of course, it speaks to Richard's point about power and influence, and in any election campaign where an independent is running against large party candidates. One of the interesting things that many people perhaps don't know is that the independent candidate's disclosure of political donations is completely transparent. Every donation above $13,800, or in my case, I lowered the threshold to $5,000, is declared, including all value placed on donations in kind, including people's time, and every cent that was spent throughout that campaign is declared. But a party candidate, their declaration comes back usually saying nil, because all political donations to a party candidate goes into that big slush fund at party headquarters, and you will never know how many donations were received for a particular electorate and how much money was spent. So I think that's problematic. Yes, there should be more independence in Parliament. I think it speaks to a greater diversity in Parliament. I think we don't have a diverse enough Parliament from the general measures. We don't have enough women. We don't have enough people of colour. We don't have enough people from various socio-demographic backgrounds to be truly representative of our population. I think independence approach every single bill on its particular value. And I know in my case, every single bill that I vote on in the House, I have thought about. And I apply a decision-making framework to that. And fundamentally for me, I ask, how does this impact the people of Indi? Is it good for Indi? How does this impact rural and regional Australia? What does it mean for rural and regional Australians? Is this ethical? Is this good governance? And what are the politics of this bill? And of course, we know that the way party politics tends to run, unless a brave soul is willing to vote against their party whip, most parliamentarians in a party vote with the party. So how do you get independence to run? Well, I guess I would say to you, in my case, I call myself a community independent. I didn't come in on a single issue. I came in with this very strong endeavour from the people of Indi, who did upset the political status quo in 2013 by electing an independent. And indeed, I have the great privilege of making history by being the first independent to follow an independent. And it's because the people said, we want better representation. And they got behind me as they got behind Cathy McGowan, and they were out there on the ground. It was so many volunteers, in fact, well over 1,000 in Indi that supported me to be elected. It takes a great big community effort, but it's completely doable. And again, I would say when looking for an independent candidate, find someone who you can look at and say, what have they been like before they were elected? Because if we know what they're like before, we'll get a pretty good indication of what they'll be like once they're elected, and then continue to support them.
Thanks, Helen. Richard, you've written a whole book called Minority Policy about the role of independents, the crossbench, and sometimes individual MPs can have on the political process. Did you want to say anything about that?
Look, obviously I agree with what we've heard, but yeah, it's interesting in Australia, we talk about party politics when we're really talking about the way party politics is done in Australia. And I've got a little joke that I use to get people to think about this. What do Americans, so in Australia, like members of a party basically vote with their party the whole time. Every single vote, once the party room's decided how they're going to vote, that's how they vote. And very rarely we see people cross the floor, which means vote against the party. So here's my little joke. What do Americans call crossing the floor? Voting. There is no term for crossing the floor in America. There is no term for crossing the floor because every time a vote is held in the US Congress, every member of Parliament acts according to the principles we just heard. How does this affect me and my constituency and what they expect me to do? So it doesn't matter whether a Democrat or a Republican is the president. It doesn't matter if a Democrat or a Republican is the leader in the House. Every time there's a vote, there's people crossing the floor because they're actually thinking for themselves. They think, well, what do I think is right here? So every vote is up for grabs in the US. Every vote is up for grabs in the UK. People cross the floor all the time in the UK, the parliament that we kind of think that we ape. So it's actually culture that has determined this incredibly rock-solid power block of the two parties in Australia. And interestingly, the Liberal Party used to define itself as the party where crossing the floor was okay. And it is okay. It's just never done. I can't remember the last time a Liberal MP crossed the floor. Yet, literally, when Menzies formed the Liberal Party, the right of each member of Parliament to cross the floor was one of the defining characteristics that he foresaw for the so-called Liberal Party. So just finally, because in Australia we have these two binding block votes, that is actually what places independents in the Australian system in such a position of power. Because, you know, once the major parties are locked in, it's the independents who are the swing vote. Now, you know, that's a wonderful thing sometimes, but it's important to understand that in virtually every other parliamentary democracy in the world, everyone's the swing vote. You know, they're all looking. And of course they come under pressure from their party. Of course they come under pressure from a lobbyist. I'm not saying pressure doesn't exist in other political cultures, but in Australia, we have a uniquely powerful two-party system combined with the most powerful block voting system in the world. And yeah, that's, I think, a terrible thing for democratic debate.
Thanks, Richard. The next question is from Julia Thornton. She asks, does the National Cabinet enable what was previously an open COAG process to be covered in secrecy by Cabinet in confidence? Or is it not really a Cabinet? Margaret, and I might come to you first and then to you, David.
I don't think that that's actually been established yet, what the status of the National Cabinet, so-called, is vis-a-vis, for example, the Federal Cabinet. Federal Cabinet's decision-making is confidential to the Cabinet room, and we understand about those principles. I don't think constitutionally yet this has been established, whether the decision-making will be confidential, and it certainly hasn't been established whether the decision-making of that body can be changed by the Federal Cabinet, for example, if it doesn't actually like what the consensus was or however they decide things. And anything which reduces transparency has got to be undesirable. One accepts that the debates need to be free without everyone looking over their shoulder, but ultimately I think we need more than a few lines of a media statement. And so from that point of view, I think it is a backward step. It might be very nice for the leaders, but I don't think it's so good for the rest of us.
Thanks. David, did you want to comment on that?
I agree with Margaret. As far as I know, nothing has been laid down or even agreed between the National Cabinet members themselves as to the degree to which their conferences, their discussions will be made public. We do know that all cabinets in every jurisdiction in Australia are very jealous about the Cabinet in confidence notion and very keen to ensure that anything they don't want to get into the public arena remains within Cabinet itself. There are very good reasons why there should be restrictions on what comes out of Cabinet, but as with so many practices that are currently underway in Australia now, the core principle is pushed far beyond its appropriate boundaries, and as a result, the Australian public is deprived of much of the information which it needs if it is to be enabled to vote with the kind of informed knowledge that you need to make the decisions that one requires before one makes up one's mind about for whom one's vote will go.
Ebony, just very quickly, it's again, we have to understand that this is culture. In New Zealand, all cabinet documents, all cabinet submissions are publicly available 2 weeks after, 2 weeks, not 20 years, 2 weeks after Cabinet has deliberated and made a decision on those documents. So in Australia, we've told ourselves that the only way to have good process is for this information to be secret. Well, all the way over in New Zealand, they've been basically releasing all this information forever. And I've taught New Zealand public servants for years, and I always ask them, how does it work? And they say, it works great. I have to write a good brief. I have to distill the evidence accurately. I have to put all the good options in front. Because if I write a brief that just helps a particular minister get their idea up, then 2 weeks after, I'll be ripped to pieces by experts who think if that's what Cabinet relied on to make a decision, you know, dear God, help us all. So again, we just like this notion of commercial in confidence, even our notion of Cabinet in confidence has been debased in Australia They don't release all the notes of all the cabinet deliberations and who said what to who in the meeting, but all of the documents that inform the cabinet decision are publicly available weeks afterwards, unless there's a very strict national security reason not to.
Thanks, Richard. That's I did not know that. That's really interesting.
If I might just comment on that too. I think the answer to the question is exactly as Margaret and David said. We don't know, the subject of this webinar today is safeguarding our democracy. So if we don't know how the National Cabinet is going to work going forward, then that's a problem in transparency. I think it also speaks to what I said at the beginning around the federal government asked for the trust of the Australian public at a time when its trust in government was at an all-time low, and yet we still gave it, which shows such good faith from us. But I think we need to be very careful here as we safeguard our democracy that we don't allow governments then to cherry-pick the parts of the crisis that worked very well for their own interests and not tell us the reasons why or how things are going to work. So again, I would bring us back to that notion of things worked very well in the pandemic with the National Cabinet. It seems many people have commented how well that worked, but there was commentary around it was good to get rid of bureaucrats. That makes me a little bit nervous. And I think the key part about what really worked during the pandemic was that we listened to the evidence of trusted experts and we followed the experts and took the politics out of it. So again, I think we should approach with caution the National Cabinet. I do.
Thanks, Helen. I guess I did want to pick up on that concept, I guess, of the culture. And, governments of any stripe never really particularly like or enjoy scrutiny. But we have seen, I think, in recent years, we've seen raids on journalists. We've seen a lot of problems associated with how Australia deals with whistleblowers, whether that's here domestically or even a case like Julian Assange internationally. What is this culture that we've seen develop? And apart from an ICAC, which is the obvious one that we've all been talking about today, how can we begin to contest that culture of secrecy? I might start with you, Helen.
Well, I would say the citizens of our nation need to demand it. I bring it back to democracy every single time. I think that the only time we ever see radical change of culture in this country is when citizens demand it. Take marriage equality, for example. Citizens demanded it, and we eventually got there. I think that each and every person listening needs to demand it of their own elected representative. And I put the call out to you. Go and see your MP. Write to them. Make it clear to them that you want to see better transparency in our parliament, and that a robust Federal Integrity Commission is a great way to do that. The other thing we haven't touched upon is the draft bill that the government gave us is of course very different to, as we understand it, very different to the bill that Cathy McGowan first put forward and that Larissa Waters then has put forward. The Greens bill that we asked to debate yesterday, in that it doesn't have a companion bill, which is a Parliamentary Standards Act. And I'm a great believer in a Parliamentary Standards Act. I think that, again, would give us a code of conduct that was a statutory code of conduct for parliamentarians and their staffers, for public officials, that would assist us in a much more transparent public governance. So
Thanks,
my message is demand it.
Thank you, Helen. I think I can hear the bells running there. Hopefully that's just a quorum and not a vote. David, oh, excellent. Safe and sound. David, I might come to you next. You've already touched on whistleblowers, but, the challenges we've seen to journalists being raided and other things as well. How would you respond to that?
That these examples are a further manifestation of the reasons why the public presently has a real disquiet about how our democracy is working. and it gives emphasis to the importance of safeguarding our democracy, the subject of this webinar. Individuals can do what they can, and I heartily endorse Helen's plea for all of us to communicate our concerns to our MPs. But we would hope that that communication is received by a more receptive audience than at present. My own efforts to communicate with my own MPs have been rewarded by anodyne responses that give me no confidence at all that any of my messages are getting through. I don't quite know how we get around that, but it is a sad reflection on the state of Australian democracy that the voice of the people at present is not being heard as it should be.
Margaret?
Of course, agree, and I'm becoming more and more in favour of more independence because one has the unhappy conclusion, I think, being imposed upon one that political parties are in fact inimical to democratic process in the Parliament. Could I just raise one other matter, because the issue of political donations has been raised, but also the role of the lobbyists that seem to me to be very much part of this conversation about safeguarding democracy. It does seem to be vastly undemocratic that you can have access to the decision makers of our country if you have a great deal of money and can pay $100,000 to have dinner with them and get their ear. And I think it needs to be regulated. It's a curse, I think, of Western democratic systems because they are everywhere. They're pervasive and made even less attractive by the fact that so many of them get employed when they have been former members of the Parliament because they have access to ears. So I think that it's another factor to put into the mix.
Thanks, Margaret. I might just sound a slightly more optimistic note and just note that when the Australian Institute first started talking about the need for establishing a federal anti-corruption commission, I don't think perhaps apart from some of the minor parties like the Greens, that really any major party was on board with that. And over the course of, I think it was 2 years, more or less, we saw the Labor Party shift and come on board with that concept. And then the coalition government, obviously things have stalled at the moment, but I will just note that we did see some movement there from the major parties, which is very encouraging. Richard, very quickly, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I don't know whether you want to comment on whistleblowers or lobbyists or anything to wrap us up there.
Yeah, look, all of the above. Democracy thrives on high expectations. And it's easy to be cynical. It's easy to be nihilistic. It's easy to think the powers that be or someone else they'll always do it. And every time we think like that, we actually empower those groups. We have to be engaged. We have to participate. It's frustrating. It's disappointing at times. But again, democracy thrives on high expectations. The minute we start to say things like all politicians this or all politicians that, when we criticise politicians, we're criticising democracy. You can't have a democracy without politicians. So we have to be very careful. We have to think, well, who's doing slightly better? And we have to always support the slightly better ones, because if we tune out from politics on the basis that, it doesn't matter, they're all the same, then we're just leaving it to the lobbyists. Like if we all leave them alone, if we stop putting pressure on them, the only people that will be left to put pressure on them are those lobbyists. So I think we just always have to, as you just did then, remind ourselves and remind each other, we did get same-sex marriage reform, despite people saying it wouldn't happen. We're so much closer to getting a federal corruption watchdog than we've ever been, despite people 10 years ago saying it was ridiculous and unnecessary. And literally 10 years ago, both major parties said there's no evidence of corruption in Canberra. So why do you need one? So let's never believe change is impossible. Every time Parliament sits, someone wins. Why can't it be us?
We might wrap it up there on that positive note. And I want to thank everyone over the last couple of years who has supported that very strong push for a federal anti-corruption commission. We are closer than ever before on that, and we need to keep pushing, not only to get it done, but to make sure that what's implemented is robust, independent, with broad jurisdiction, and is implemented as soon as possible. But I will wrap it up there. So thank you so much for your time today, particularly while Parliament is sitting, Helen Haines. We really appreciate it. And thank you to David Harper and Margaret White, and as well to Richard Dennis, who joins us most weeks. Thank you so much, all of you, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions.
This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned and make sure you're subscribed. You can check out the Australia Institute's webinar series at our website, tai.org.au/webinars. Our next event is on Wednesday, the 17th of June at 10 a.m, where Richard Dennis will be in conversation with former Bernie Sanders advisor, Professor Stephanie Kelton, about her new book, The Deficit Myth, which explains modern monetary theory and the role of deficit spending in the economy. And the following day, on Thursday, June the 18th at 11 a.m, you can join Alan Gyngell, the National President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and Alan Beam, Director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program, and they'll be talking about how misrepresenting policy issues as security problems does not solve them. You can visit tai.org.au for all our latest research and analysis, and for all the latest health information, check out health.gov.au. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Helen Haines is at Helen Haines Indi, that's INDI, and Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum. Thanks for listening.